Hello, my name is Freeman. In this video, I will present our paper titled Understanding and Mitigating Challenges for Nonprofit-Driven Indie Game Development to Innovate Game Production on behalf of my co-authors Lingyuan, Nathan McNeese, and Kelsea Schulenberg. At a high level, indie games can be broadly described as games that are consciously created outside of the production and distribution structures of the mainstream game companies. However, the indie game development community is also highly heterogeneous, as people often engage in indie game development for various reasons, such as being rebelling, as hobbyists, just making games for fun, or not yet qualified or skilled enough to enter the mainstream gaming industry. In contrast, non-profit-driven indie game development has grown into an emerging movement for innovating game development and production. It mainly operates on an activist agenda in hopes of innovating how digital games can be designed and produced by collectively advocating values of sharing, openness, and creativity rather than just focus on revenues. Although not every indie developer is operating on a nonprofit and activist agenda, in this paper we focus on unpacking the various challenges that this subset of indie game developers face in their endeavors to innovate game production, and our reflections on potential technology designs for helping them mitigate such challenges. This leads to our research question: how do non-profit-driven indie game developers face unique challenges in their practices to innovate game development and production? To collect data, we conducted 28 interviews with non-profit-driven indie game developers across various countries and cultures and did an in-depth qualitative analysis of the interview data. Our findings show three unique challenges that nonprofit-driven indie game developers across various countries and cultures encounter when they try to innovate game production. The first is emerging tensions in both team-based labor and individual labor to pursue the nonprofit agenda. These tensions include challenges to seek qualified and reliable team labor when taking indie development seriously, nonprofit-driven innovation as a personal burden, and diversity concerns for building an inclusive nonprofit-driven indie workforce. The second challenge is the lack of various forms of capital to sustain indie developers' endeavors for achieving the nonprofit agenda. Our findings show that these developers often lack technological resources, including hardware, network, and software, lack social capital, which means they lack public visibility and acknowledgement of their reputation and work. They also lack financial stability because they do not perceive profit-seeking as their main goal when engaging in indie development. However, this also means that the games may never be profitable and their effort may never pay off. The third challenge is the barriers to innovate the traditional game production models through the nonprofit agenda. Such barriers include concerns about protecting nonprofit indie developers' copyright and intellectual property. As this participant said, the copyright system in India is not friendly to indie game developers. For every tiny idea and every tiny thing that you make, you have to file a copyright. There are also technology and economic policy barriers for entrepreneurship. As this Japanese participant said, indie game development is considered part of the innovative business in Japan, so they have on paper a lot of grants and help from the government. They pay you like 3 years after they love the game, so the reality there is not a lot of help. To discuss the implications of this work, we want to provide a critical inquiry to elaborate on these tensions emerging in nonprofit-driven indie game development as a potential alternative production model to innovate future development, especially regarding the unique interplay of labor, capital, and production in this space. First, many participants in our study admitted that it required tremendous time and economic investment to develop indie games, and many of them, in fact, did not have sufficient capital, either financially, socially, or technologically, to start and sustain their ongoing labor and production in this field. We then ask, if only certain types of people can participate in non-profit-driven indie game development, who can or cannot afford to pursue this agenda for their artistic and cultural goals? Second, while this alternative game production model promotes important values of openness and independence in game development, it still cannot and should not ignore the intertwining power relations between the largely revenue-driven traditional gaming industry, more profit-driven indie studios, and the indie game development community with a non-profit agenda. This leads to a critical question: how can individual indie developers gain more influence and capital in the non-profit model rather than becoming more vulnerable in the complex power structure, as the mainstream gaming industry still controls both technical and financial resources? Third, our findings show two concerning issues that may hinder non-profit indie game developers' long-term efforts. Above all, there are high expectations and excessive personal burdens on individual indie game developers to achieve, preserve, and embrace various non-profit-driven community values, but lack effective mechanisms to support their efforts for pursuing these values. Additionally, it is still unclear how and what national or regional policies should be designed and implemented to support this alternative game production model that focuses more on artistic and cultural values than seeking profit. Without such support at the national or at least the regional level, it would be challenging to sustain non-profit-driven indie game development as a long-term, collective, and systematic effort to influence and advance future games and gaming technologies. We also want to acknowledge the challenges identified in this research to be fundamentally socio-technical, which means that leveraging various technical design directions in parallel with social initiatives will be necessary to mitigate these challenges within the indie community. Therefore, we want to highlight three high-level design directions for rethinking technology design as a mechanism for mitigating the non-profit-driven indie community's challenges. We first want to highlight the direction of designing for evaluating the compatibility of potential teammates for indie developers in terms of skills, quality, reliability, personality, work styles, and even goals. We then want to highlight the direction of designing for embedding diversity throughout the game development process. Lastly, we want to highlight the importance of designing for leveraging existing resources to enhance game production. In conclusion, we hope the HCI community will continue to explore how technology design can push the nonprofit indie game development model in a direction that does not just facilitate game development and production for the privileged few, but instead support a more diverse and inclusive population's engagement in innovating game development. Thank you for watching. We want to thank our participants and the National Science Foundation for supporting this research.